We live in the modern age, where if the crops fail or our president dies, we don't have to worry about being brutally sacrificed to appease angry gods, or to ensure our departed ruler has a smooth transition to the afterlife. Yet for thousands of years, humans have been sacrificing each other for a variety of reasons. If you can think of it, odds are someone somewhere murdered somebody else over it. Many of these sacrifices were done relatively humanely, with most cultures not seeing a need to prolong the suffering of the poor sod getting killed. But others believed that violence and pain were part of the ritual. Let's start with the Shang Dynasty, China. Before China was unified around 221 BC by Qin Shi Huang, who thought that sacrificing people was a pretty not cool thing to do, it was all the rage to sacrifice people to appease the spirits, and at no time in the Chinese history was it more in vogue than during the Shang Dynasty of 1600 to 1040 BC. A popular form of sacrifice was to behead males from other tribes in order to worship male ancestors. The more important the ancestor, the more heads that would roll. To think, when you die, you'll probably just get a lousy bouquet of flowers on your grave. But the spirits must have gotten pretty bored of chopped off heads, so eventually the Chinese moved on to splitting people in half in order to appease their ancestors. Historical records are unclear, but we're assuming that that would be horizontally, and likely with teams of horses. Although if they had very large blades and a lot of time on their hands, they could probably manage a vertical split. But again, the spirits are restless, so the Chinese moved on to dismembering people with axes, often hundreds at a time to appease their ancestors. A victim would have their stomach slashed open, and their guts would fall to the floor, which surprisingly is not a quick way to die and can take quite a while, though we suppose that that was probably the point. Lastly, victims were sometimes simply beaten to death, although at this point that barely even seems like they were trying anymore. Hawaii. When you think of Hawaii, you probably think of beautiful beaches and a warm tropical sun. With so much beauty around them, surely native Hawaiians were a peaceful people who celebrated life. I mean, they lived in freaking Hawaii. But you'd be wrong, because humans are terrible and ritual human sacrifice was common in paradise. Typically reserved for captives taken from war, ritual sacrifices took place during the dedication of a war temple to the Tiki war god Ku, but could happen during other significant events. Others who broke a kapu or taboo were also sacrificed, and could be tied up to have their bones broken with sticks, have their intestines removed, or simply beheaded. You might think that surely Hawaii left its human sacrificing days way in the past, but recently as 1804, a human sacrifice of 3 men was recorded. Ancient Israelites. There are many mentions in the Bible of ancient Israelites that worshipped other gods, and of Yahweh's or the God of the Bible's angry disapproval of them. Learning about Israelites who worshipped Moloch, a god of nature, it's hard to disagree with God on the matter. Ancient Israelites regularly sacrificed infants to their various gods, often by binding the child and then burning it alive. And this wasn't just captives taken in war either, but sometimes their own. Thankfully for children everywhere, the Israelites who would eventually become the first Christians and Jews came along and told everyone to knock it off, because burning children to appease nature is pretty nuts. Inca. Nowadays, if you're hoping for wealth, you might take a business class or two, perhaps invest in the stock market. But if you were an ancient Incan, the most logical thing to do would be to raise a child from a baby, shower it its whole life with luxury, love and affection, feed it well and ensure it has a happy life, and then strangle it to death as an offering to the gods. The Inca believed that a healthy, happy child, well, happy up until, being strangled to death, was the greatest gift that any god could receive. And so thousands of children were sacrificed for the sake of increasing wealth and good fortune. Because the gods are picky though, only strong, healthy, and attractive children were suitable. So if you were ugly, we guess you lucked out. While some children were strangled to death, others had their heads caved in, and yet others were burned alive. Mesopotamians. If there's one thing that binds all ancient humans together, it's the belief that for some weird reason if a king dies, they're helpless in the afterlife unless literally everyone who served him immediately joins him. And yet people still vied for these positions of power. But imagine showing up for your first day of work as a fancy new chancellor, only to have the king immediately croak. Congratulations on your early and very immediate retirement. The ancient Mesopotamians were no exception to this rule, and they too would send their kings off into the afterlife with a mass funeral. But while the ancient Egyptians famously had close advisors and pets buried with them, the Mesopotamians killed literally everybody that had anything to do with the dead king. soldiers, members of the royal court, handmaidens, and servants. If you once made eye contact with the king, there's a good chance you were getting sacrificed. At least the Mesopotamians didn't mess around when it came to human sacrifices. While for years experts believed that victims were peacefully poisoned before burial, new evidence has proved that this was hilariously wrong. Instead, the dead-to-be were simply stabbed in the head. No mess, no fuss, just a spike to the brain. Of course, these types of injuries can often not be immediately fatal and could result in an excruciating death. The Aztecs. Naturally, no conversation on human sacrifice can be complete without bringing up the mighty Aztecs, who were absolutely nuts about murdering people for their gods. Believing that they owed everything, even life itself, to the many precocious gods, the Aztecs would routinely sacrifice thousands of victims a year. Many civilizations engaged in human sacrifice, but the Aztecs made it a downright hobby and were incredibly creative about it. Various gods required various types of sacrifices, and victims were chosen depending on their physical characteristics and how they related to the gods. Children, for instance, were required sacrifices for Tlaloc, the rain god, and they believed that the tears of the newborns or infants would ensure the rain. So their particular sacrifices were often protracted affairs. The more tears a child shed, the more rain that would come. Most victims would be marched up to the top of a pyramid and forced to lay upon an altar, where a priest would then stab the victim in the stomach about the navel and rip the knife up to just below the throat. Then the priest would reach into the victim's chest and pull out the often still beating heart, before kicking the body down the pyramid stairs for it to be dismembered. Sometimes those sacrifices would take the form of a mock battle between a priest and a captive, with the priest armed with real weapons and the captive, often tied to a stone or wooden frame, fought with wooden or feathered weapons. Needless to say, the odds were firmly against the victim and their feathery weapons, yet the other victims would have their skin flayed off and worn as costumes in various rituals. Those rituals typically awarded body parts as trophies, and the warriors who captured the victims could be awarded a femur to proudly display at home. That, we think, is the real problem with today's society. Too many participation trophies and not enough human femurs. Let's all be grateful that science and reason has moved humanity well past the kill people to appease angry gods stage of evolution. Yet with so much science denial in our society today on issues such as climate change, sometimes we wonder just how far away we really are from our bloodthirsty roots. What's the most brutal sacrifice technique you've ever heard of? Would you be interested in being ritually sacrificed by the staff of the Infographics show as we ask the gods for continued success? Just kidding. Make sure you check out our other video, Worst Punishments in the History of Mankind. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.